Well, good afternoon. I'm sorry I'm a couple minutes late. As usual, I had my technical difficulties. Welcome to LDS 404 Leadership and Change. I think this will be a very interesting course for you, and I hope that we can discuss amongst ourselves and with each other things that we know that we can do to affect change. Change is always difficult to affect. And I probably will say this more than one time throughout the course. It's difficult to affect because we humans like to keep things the way they are. And we don't like to always be changing things and being in the midst of what we might consider to be turmoil. And I remember years ago, I was in a former life, I was working for a private clinical laboratory, and we had moved to a new location. And I told the boss, who would come out occasionally and help us uh, do perform the tests that we were doing, that I had moved something to make it more convenient with what we were doing. I put testing samples and not testing samples, but things that we use to do the test, implements and glassware and things of that nature, right beneath where we ran a test in drawers. And his response was, well, if it stands the test of time. I don't know if that was a good response from him or a bad response from him. I thought I did something that it wasn't much of a change. I thought I did something with making it more convenient for people instead of having to walk halfway across the room to get stuff to bring it back where you're going to work. But I think that's how often, and that may not be the best example in the world, but I think that's often how we look at change. We don't look at change for what is going to benefit us or what is going to benefit the organization or maybe our group or team or maybe even ourselves as individuals. And so I hope as we go through this course and use Burke's text here that we'll come to some good understanding of what it takes to change things and how we have to approach that, both as those being changed, in other words, the change that's going to affect us as opposed to us affecting the change, and how we can do that and get through things. So Burke talks, this is a very short first chapter. Burke talks about this chapter he calls Sources for Understanding Change. So let's look at what he does. This is in his introduction mode. I'm going to blow this up for you just a little bit. He talks about the core themes of change. Again, this is part of the introduction. Planned versus unplanned. I think we can all think about that. Revolutionary versus evolutionary. And then organizational continuity versus external environment discontinuity. So let's look along here a little bit more about what Burke has to say. This again is part of the introduction. He talks about most change books that discuss change. Now, obviously, he's not talking about his own. And articles focus on, I'm going to change a little bit of what he says here. I'm going to use the term status quo. The continuity and stabilization. Let's stay where we are, in some respects and make the change happen, but we're going to really stay where we are rather than continuity, just a second here. I want to get away from this to make sure we are saying the right thing here, rather than discontinuity and change. So what he's saying is that, in essence, to boil this down just a little bit, he's saying that organizations and people are more interested in the familiar and the stable as opposed to disruption. In other words, if we can't keep where we are and maybe make some incremental improvements, we're going to be better off than if we have to go through some disruption, or through, let me change this around a little bit, say through some change that's going to cause disruption. And Burke goes on to say that we need to have a better understanding of change. And what he means by this, and we'll go through some of what he's saying here. What he means by that, there's a lot of sources about change, but a lot of them really aren't complete. And he talks about things coming from outside the academic area, and he uses the term non-traditional here. What he's really saying is that there's a lot of things that are out there about change, but they're really not put together real well, or they don't involve all the things we ought to think about. They don't provide support. So let's go along a little bit further with this in his with this introduction. Excuse me, I got lost in my thoughts here. There he talks about organizations, theory literature, trade literature, which would be people who are in the business world, if you will, or not necessarily the business world. It could be in nonprofits or they could be in government. And they talk about change, and they write about change and how they implemented change, etc. And this is what I've learned as I've done things, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it is coming from an individual from his or her own perspective, and perhaps in certain settings which were conducive to implementing change, but they really don't tell the whole story. And then storybooks that based on allegory and metaphors, allegory, symbolic meanings, and metaphor, word or phrase that's needed or that is used, excuse me, to compare things that are unlike each other. I know that sounds a little confusing, but that's what the metaphor is. Now, here he talks about the drawbacks from each one of these sources. And I want you to keep in mind here, and Burke really kind of says this in his book. Yeah, he's a source, and he tries to back up what he's done and what he's talked about through his work as a consultant and as an academic at Columbia University in New York. And we can take some of that with a grain of salt, etc. But he's trying to point out some shortfalls of things that we need to pay attention to. Organizations theory literature, it talks about focusing on continuity. And Burke is going to make a pretty big point here later on, and he does in the text, that continuity has gotten in the way of progress in a lot of large companies. We could think of perhaps General Motors. We could think of some other companies that have been, that we think of as behemoths. And being the behemoth that they are, they're too hard to turn around. Well, let me take that back just a second. Not so much too hard to turn around, but it takes a good deal of time to turn them around. And so it's Burke's talking about here. Trade literature. Look what he says down here. It's based upon what I have said. I am the guru of this change, but there's nothing that validates what I'm saying. In other words, what could have worked in my organization that I'm writing about doesn't apply to anybody else because nobody else could validate what I found. They couldn't take my results and replicate them someplace else. And so it's only valid for that particular organization. And then storybooks are just kind of telling you how to do things. And he makes a couple of interesting points in here. The book was very, very popular about 15 or 20 years ago, Who Moved My Cheese? And there's a couple other ones that he refers to in here. Now, in trying to make his, hello, Miss Knox, I hope you can hear us. And trying to make his case, he brings up this gentleman by the name of Cotter. Cotter's 8 points. And I'm sorry, I've lost the top part of this on the slide here. I have to see if I can fix that around so you can see what I'm talking about. But anyway, Cotter's 8-step process. And I'm not going to go through this with you because it is listed in the text. You can read this on the slide for yourself. If you're not tuned in today, you can see this tomorrow once the audio and video lecture is uploaded. And one of the things he says at the first there is establishing a sense of urgency, and I think we can all agree with that. And then he goes on talking about communication, obviously, is important, empowerment's important, and then finally anchoring the new approaches and culture, which is important but very difficult to do. It's very difficult to change an organization's culture. And what he says here about Cotter, and you can find this in the text, is really he says that Cotter's 8 steps are oversimplistic, and they really don't do everything that they should do, don't answer all the questions they ought to answer. Here he talks about, get away so you can see this whole slide, future personal history, lifelong learning. Obviously, this is something we as adults really need to pay attention to because we need to continue to learn as we go through our lives. Knowledge, leadership, other capacity for dealing with competition, etc. Now he brings in The Tipping Point, which was a book written by Malcolm, I think I have his first name correct, Malcolm Gladwell in 2000. And what he says here is a theory of how change occurs. And he likes Gladwell, and he kind of extols Gladwell in this book, at least in chapter 1. He talks about contagiousness and that change occurs at a dramatic moment and not gradually. Now, there are people who would argue with that. I wanted to read that to you because I want to get that point in. I know I skipped number 2. I'll come back to that. And that is people at Toyota who champion themselves on incremental change would probably disagree with that. But if we look at how change has happened, how it has taken place, we can think of in the political arena in the United States, we can think of other things. There have been some cataclysmic events that caused the change to occur. Now, cataclysmic, we always think of, like a big explosive type thing. I don't necessarily have to think of it that way, but we have to think that it's kind of like a Big Bang type idea. Change really takes hold quickly. But what we have to do is to make sure that the pathway, if you will, is set so the change can take hold quickly. What about small changes? One of the biggest things that I've noticed in reading this material and understanding it from somewhat respects, instead of actually being doing, but from an academic standpoint, but also from doing, is that if you can make something small happen and people change there, and people can see the benefits of that change, it's going to be much easier for them to accept the large change that you're trying to implement. So if you think of small steps, and think of this big event that you want to happen, and there's 100 small steps or 100 steps smaller than the ultimate goal, and you can make something in there, you can let people see that change is beneficial to them. It's going to be a lot easier for them to navigate both mentally and physically to the end state. Not to mean the end state's going to happen right away, but they're going to feel better about about getting there. He has a little something more here about Gladwell. Gladwell here is talking about the few, and he really is talking here about different types of people that help foster change. He speaks of three different people, or three different categories of people. He mentions connectors, mavens, and salespeople. And they use the term connector here, and they say that's really synonymous with facilitators. And we know what a facilitator does. A facilitator does not tell you how to do things. He or she helps you do things and gives you the resources to help you do things and points you along the way to get there. So what happens here is that the person who is moving from point A to point B in this change process, and he or she gets to the end state, and boy, I really have accomplished something, and it was that person that really focused me to do something. And the facilitator will say, no, I really didn't do that. I just gave you everything you needed to help you get there. That's a win-win type thing, if you will. Mavens, even while they have something there in this terminology about what mavens do, I like to think of mavens as being people who are really advocates for something. That's really something they want to do. They bought into this whole process, and they really, they've got it here between the ears, and they really want to push that forward and let everybody understand it and share it, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all true. I just think that these people are zealots, excuse me, that they want to push this idea forward. And I don't think of them as being, pushy types, but they're really going to want to get things over. And so I think that mavens and salespeople, pardon me, are really about the same, except they're a little bit different. A maven is somebody who's really into this thing and can see it and lives it and breathes it and all this kind of stuff, and we know that. And they may be kind of a semi-expert, if you will, whereas the salesperson is more of a persuader, as is on the slide here. And he or she is trying to show you through a sales pitch the benefits of this change. Gladwell talks about getting your message across using a variety of methods. We really don't need to discuss this a whole lot. How you get things across doesn't make much difference. It's that you get them across. But some people will talk about campaign stickers. They'll talk about mottos and things of that nature. I would say to you that those are all good things to use, but you have to make sure that they're going to connect with people. I'll give you a perfect example. President Ford, back in the 1970s, was faced with rising inflation. And that, by the way, that rising inflation went on beyond his term and into President Carter's and the first part of Ronald Reagan's first term. And he had came out with a slogan, and he had a button he used to wear on his lapel. It was a win button. And it stood for Whip Inflation Now. Well, that was obviously considered to be a dud. It didn't resonate with anybody. And it was more or less dead on arrival. So that's what I'm talking about, having a campaign sticker or button or something of that nature. Make sure it resonates with people, that it doesn't turn them off, that's something that they can gravitate to, and something that they can embrace and go forward with. Talking about telling stories here, and making sure that you get the story out and it's repeated often, and perhaps a little differently, if you will, but it gets across. Notice here what he says. It's the context that determines what people are doing. And Gladwell says it takes 150 people to create a tipping point. I'm not going to argue with that. I don't think I've been in a situation where I wanted to count up to 150 people to see if that was true or not. But we'll take Gladwell at his word. Now let's go a little bit further here. Too far. Gladwell is also talking here about the power content. Well, excuse me, I had that. I beg your pardon. Looked at it differently. He's talking here about social channel capacity, which comes from an author by the name of Dunbar. Notice that he says here that as more people join our group, the relationships or the number of relationships increases. He says exponentially, and we'll take him at his word for that. I'm sure there's a finite number there, but I'm not going to argue with that. And then he talks about this 150 people, saying it's the maximum number of persons with whom anyone can be familiar with. In other words, if you get more than 150 people, you're not going to be able to interact with everybody. Now, I know that some of you are probably saying to yourselves right now, and I am in that crowd, I don't know that 150 is right. I think it's probably smaller, and I would agree with that. However, we're going to give Gladwell his due and say, okay, he's correct, and we're not going to talk about that too much. But what we have to make sure of doing when we have this group, that these interrelationships are actually growing. And the reason that that's important is you don't want somebody who is in this group or some bodies who are in this group to feel like they're really outsiders, because now that becomes a problem. Now you have to fix the group that's trying to fix something else, and you're going to spend more time on fixing the group. If any of you have been in group dynamics, group theory, understanding group theory, especially small groups, you know that groups go through 5 stages: forming, norming, storming, performing, and adjourning. So that's what you have to be careful with here. And you do not want to spend your time and your resources and your energy on keeping this group moving forward. Gladwell goes on to say, this is coming from Gladwell, talks about transactive memory. Notice what he says here, that people who know each other well will have a joint memory system. And what that simply means is that if I, person A, forget something and I'm interacting with person B, because of our interactions, one of us will cause the other one to remember. And it helps the group. This is part of this, at least as far as I'm concerned, what I would call this farming capacity that you have in a group. And this is where the group really gets together and finds out, to use a phrase, who's who in the zoo. And then, of course, you get to some other areas and things of that nature. I want to go back to the 150 again, and the only reason I'm quizzical about 150, and again, I'm not going to question Gladwell, is that when you get over a certain number, it's really kind of hard to manage that number. So if that's part of what you're trying to do here with this group is manage the number, you have to be careful, because again, as I say, you don't want to be spending all your resources on doing something that's not as productive as what you want it to be. Now we're going to come kind of to the close of what Burke is saying here, at least in the slides that we have for chapter 1. And Burke is telling us, just a second here, Burke is saying here the sources for organizational change, these various fields of thought, fields of study, fields of discipline, all fall into the same category, if you will. And we can see here that there's some things that we're probably familiar with, some things that we would think wouldn't fit, like life sciences. Why would life sciences fit into a topic of organizational change and leadership, putting people through the change? And then nonlinear complex systems theory. Not something maybe most of us have thought much about, but certainly something that we have to pay attention to. And his final slide, or the final slide that comes with this, he talks about some things that we have to do, and he talked about case study principles. And there are a couple of case studies in the text. He has a short case study on pages 6 and 7. He really doesn't go into a whole lot like a case study normally would. But there is another one in here about British Airways later on in the text, etc., that we have to think about. So when we have a case study, these are the principles that we find in a case study. And let's look at these. The first bullet we have here are the outside elements that are forcing the change. Now, we're going to go back and talk about something he had there at Teachers College at Columbia University in New York. See the future must be painted. The future must be painted, and there must be a sense of urgency. Now, when we say sense of urgency, we don't necessarily mean urgency tomorrow or the next minute or the next hour or the next several hours. We mean that there has to be an urgency and commitment to get into the change scenario and the process, so we can get to the end state we want to do. Consequences. What we'll find, and we see a little bit more graphically displayed when we get to the slides in chapter 2 and in chapter 2, and as we go through the course, he talks about consequences. And what it says here really is that change seldom occurs as planned. I'm not going to jump ahead and talk to you about a slide we're having coming up in chapter 2, but it's true, we plan change, and we think we know where we're going because we have a roadmap or a blueprint, if you will, and then something occurs that was either not thought of, not planned for. It could be something spontaneous that was, out of the blue, that causes us to make a change in what we had planned. Resistance. We're going to find resistance to change no matter what we do, and the resistance will not always be the same type of resistance, and it won't always come from the same people and everybody affected by the change won't always resist for the same reason or reasons. We can expect people who have been on the job longer to have different reasons for resisting change than people who have been hired and been on the job just a relatively short period of time. And the role of the change leader must be a person who is open. Now, what I mean by open here, and what Burke means by open, is not necessarily that this person is open to change his or her ideas or what the change that he or she are supposed to implement, facilitate, and implement. That is an open person to listening to people, to the ideas that they bring forth, and to solicit people in helping build the coalition to move the change along. So that's what this means, and I didn't mean to say that, and open to ideas and thoughts of others. Now, in conclusion of not the slides, because we're finished with the slides. In conclusion, I really strongly recommend that you read the short scenario that he has called, starts on page 6 and ends on page 7, short story on launching organizational change. Burke makes 2 points there as you read the story, and I'm going to try to paraphrase both of those. One is that the change agent needs to provide a clear vision on what will take place. And as Burke says, the vice president here does lay out a clear vision. Secondly, the person who is the change implementer, that's the term I'm going to use here, has to acknowledge that there is going to be some frustration and some uncomfortableness as they go through, as the organization goes through this change. Now, whether we're talking here about change in a particular team or teams, or whether a particular department within the company or organization, or the organization as a whole, it really doesn't make too much difference. What makes the difference here is that it has to acknowledge that there are going to be bumps in the road, that everybody's not going to be comfortable all the way, that there may be some loss of production and understanding. But, and here's the but, and this is a very important but, the short-term frustrations and uncomfortable feeling, both mentally and physically, will eventually lead to the long-term end state where we want to go, which will benefit not only the organization, but every individual who works for and in the organization. So I think this gives us a fairly good introduction of what Burke is trying to do, and how Burke's going to lead us, and how we can get through this. Not how we can get through, how we will go through the course and talk about things. So we're going to take a short break here. It's 5:04, almost 5:05, and we'll take about a 5-minute break. And then we're going to come back and do his second chapter, which is rethinking organizational change. So it's just turned 5:05, and we'll take a short break here. And I said we'll come back in 5 minutes. Let's make that come back in 4 minutes. It's 5:09, and then we'll get back into what Burke has to tell us. Thank you. Please come back at 5:09. Okay, it's 5:09. We're back. We're ready to talk about Chapter 2, Rethinking Organization Change. And Burke talks about here at the beginning why organization change efforts fail. And there are some pretty compelling reasons here. Uh, Changing the culture of an organization to be able to accept the change is very difficult. We said before, and I think we all will agree with this, maybe we don't want to. We're creatures of habit. And it's very difficult for us to change, especially after we've been doing things for a long period of time. Second is, it's not easy for me to tell you, I'm the change facilitator, to tell you, an employee, that we have to change. Especially when it seems like, as the parenthesis comments, that everything's in pretty good shape. Why should why should I have to change if my sales are up, etc. And I think that we can answer that in some respects as we look at the change that we have gone through and how we disseminate information today. I was reading something not too long ago, and it may have been today, and I can't remember where. Well, yes, I was reading Warren Bennis, some of Warren Bennis's book. In the 1990s, well, let's just say 1990 itself, there were only about 400 people who were into the internet. I don't know what the number in millions is today. And those folks, those 400, they were mostly in academia and in government, had no idea what we were going to morph into. Now let's take this back a little bit further. Thomas Watson, who was the founder of IBM, and his cronies, and don't take that to be a bad word, just a word I want to use, felt that in the 1940s, when the supercomputer was first coming into being, that we would only need 4 supercomputers to hold all the information contained in the world. What's wrong with that statement, or what's wrong with that thought? The thought is that the medium that I'm using to deliver this, a personal computer, holds more information than those 4 supercomputers that were thought of in the 1940s, maybe a little bit before that, could hold. And those had to be in air-conditioned rooms because of all the tubes they had on them. And finally, his last point on this slide, I should say fine, but his last point on this slide is that we don't know very well how to plan for change, and then once we plan for the change, how to put it into action. We humans just aren't very good at that. Even though we know the world is continually changing as we sit here today and talk and think and read the textbook and think about uploading assignments and interacting with our fellow students through the forum section. Now, Burke talks here about the paradox of planned organization change. Notice what he says here. When we plan, we're planning in a linear fashion. In other words, here's our starting point and here's our end point, and we know exactly how we're going to get there. It's a straight line. And we know from when we grew up in school and learned an axiom, if we took geometry, that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And yet, even though we're going to plan in a linear fashion, the implementation process is anything but linear. And this is figure 2.1, which you can see in your text. And what it's saying here is you're starting down here at point A, and you want to get to point B, which is up here in the upper right-hand corner. As you look at it, they're pretty close to it. And it's anything but a straight line. I would call it a corkscrew. You could call it anything you want, but corkscrew comes to my mind. That's what it kind of looks like to me. And it's not even a good corkscrew, by the way. So we have to think about that. And that's part of the problem that we have. We've done a linear process. We've completed a linear process. We know how to get from point A to point B or point Z, whatever point it happens to be. And we put this baby that we've created into action, and we find out that it's anything but linear. It's going to go haywire in some cases because humans do that. Okay. This can be a little confusing on a slide here, what it says, but I'm going to try to make this so it isn't as confusing as it seems. Pardon me. The capital markets, in other words, those markets in which companies, for-profit companies I'm talking about here mostly, do business, they're ahead of a company's rate of change. Notice the capital markets say, the money, if you want to think about these as security markets, that's fine, say that there has to be some disruption, whereas corporations focus on the status quo, and they need to make those changes. And the changes, we like this continuity, we like this comfort, we're going to stay here, and we're going to make incremental changes. And Burke says at the end that if you want to stay at the pinnacle where you are, you have to abandon continuity and take on disruption. And I'm not going to read this slide to you. What it says here is that various and sundry not-for-profit organizations, obviously government is not, many universities are not all of them are, but perhaps most of them are, and nonprofits have to stay in touch with their constituents, with the markets that they serve, for lack of a better term, in order just to stay where they are. Organizations, and I'll talk about universities, have to be competitive. They have to be ready to adapt. If they're not, they're probably going to be surpassed. And I mean, they might go out of business, but they're going to be surpassed. And so, because they do that, corporations do the same thing, but often they're not listening. That's kind of what Burke is saying. They're not listening to what's being told to them, and so they don't act and react as they should. And that's not to say, by the way, that universities, nonprofits, and governments always do the right thing either. It's just that corporations need to pay attention to do that. Now, we talked about metaphors, and he talks here about choice for organization change, and what Gareth Morgan did in 1997. Using metaphors helps us understand, helps us gain insights, and he's saying here the way organizations work and operate. Burke says that he believes the metaphor of choice for understanding organization change or organizational change is the same as in an organism. Now, here we're bringing into change, which we think is change in how organizations work, and we're talking about a living organism. Now, what's the difficulty here? First of all, let's look at the thing about the organization, the organism metaphor. Now, what I want to talk here, and we're going to see this, pardon me, in a later slide, is that we can relate to organisms. We know what they are. An organization is a corporation. Maybe it's a better way to say that than just organization. It's a social construct. In other words, it does not exist unless society says this is what it is. Now, I want to digress here, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but I want to use this as a metaphor. The largest social construct we have in the world is race. We say people are different because they look different to us. Their color is different. We have black-skinned people, red-skinned people, yellow-skinned people, sort of a tannish-colored people. I'm speaking about the Arabic cultures. And maybe I'm being disingenuous when I say that, but I don't mean to be. But when we strip away everything that's there, and here we're talking about physical appearance, and I'm talking about stature or height, weight, etc. And we strip away that social construct, we're the same. Well, I'll have 2 eyes and 2 ears and a nose and a brain and a heart and 2 lungs and 2 kidneys, etc., etc. But we have socially constructed a difference based on color. So that's what we're talking here about. That's what I'm trying to say to you about an organization. A corporation is a social construct. It is what it is because we say that's what it is. But an organism is not an organism because we say that's what it is. It is because it is. So here with his metaphor is interactions between the organism's external environment and its internal environment. What's inside us? And we take stuff in from the outside and change that to go through a chemical compound that we go through to, I'm talking here now mostly about food, ingest it and turn it into things of energy, and of course a certain amount of that is waste, et cetera, et cetera. And what is it that an organism wants to do? It wants to take, pardon me, enough in from its external environment to provide nutrients to its internal environment so it can survive. That's exactly what an organization wants to do. Now, Burke says that even though he likes the organism metaphor, there's some limitations. And here we come up with a social construct. An organism, we know what an organism is. And it is because it is. It's not because some human said that's what it is. Right, now, please don't tell me that's not exactly right, because we gave the organism a name. We gave humans a name, and so that's all true. But we didn't change that by giving the organism a name. The organism's still an organism. We didn't change it. Notice here that what he says next is it says that if we say that, we're saying that the organization exists primarily dependent upon its external environment. And we know that's not true. We know for a fact that organizations do everything they can within their power, especially the large ones, to change the external environment. And certainly they work to change the internal environment. And in some cases they will say, okay, the internal environment is us, And we're opposed to the external environment because the external environment doesn't understand us. And that doesn't mean to say they don't interact with the external environment. Don't try to sell them goods and products and things of that nature. That's not meant to be. But it can create an insular mentality. Organisms have interdependent parts. Our body depends upon the brain and the lungs functioning together to provide nutrients, etc. Through the pumping of blood through the system and the lungs aerating that blood. And notice that say that organizations don't ordinarily operate in the same manner. Now, if you're in a large organization, and some of our courses will kind of touch on this. I work in a department, and often departments tend to be insular. We don't interact with those folks down the hall unless we're needed. I'll give you an example. When I was in the Army and stationed in St. Louis at the large personnel center out there was an entity within the organization that had kind of formed after a while. They took people from various parts of different offices and created this new entity. And nobody liked them because they thought because they were handpicked, they were better than everybody else. And when we had to interact with them, they would come and try to tell us what our business was. And so most of us, and I will put myself in a category, we just didn't interact with them. We avoided them like the plague. After a period of time, what they were constructed to do, we decided to take I'm talking about the Army here, decided to take a different tack, and it was disbanded. These people went back to where they had been or were reassigned somewhere else. So we all have these type things. And then finally, look here, he says that even though he says this, it may become ideology as opposed to a guide. And so what he's saying here is we have to be careful that we don't adopt this whole thing lock, stock, and barrel and say, okay, well, this is the way it is. And it's not a guide to get us somewhere. It's not a guide. It's not a benchmark to use on how we can evaluate what we're doing. Now, Burke talks here about open systems theory. And open systems theory, as he mentions, comes from biology. And notice he says it stems from the life sciences. And he says they're more relevant if we understand the life sciences and organisms, of course, open systems theory. They're more relevant to understanding organizations and change than those of the physical sciences. A little bit different here. Now, Burke talks about types of organization change. And you can see these graphically displayed. They're also in your text. And he talks about things of revolutionary versus evolutionary. I'm not going to go through all these strategic versus operational, etc. And notice what his little provision is at the bottom of the slide. And he says, even though these are considered to be opposites, each of these types of change, they're not mutually exclusive. And so let me give you one that I probably can talk about a lot better than any of the rest of them, because we talked about this when I was in the Army. You have strategic and operational. Well, yes, they're different. Operational usually talks about at the unit level. Of course, that unit could be a large unit, whereas strategic normally talks about something of national imperatives, for instance. An example is the United States Army is often criticized for not going into Berlin at the end of World War II. And that's what caused people say that the Soviets got in there and the city was split into East Berlin, West Berlin, et cetera, et cetera. The reason that the United States Army did not go into Berlin is because it was not considered to be a strategic initiative. It wasn't considered to be strategically important to go into Berlin. Hindsight may tell us that it was, but at that time, the national policymakers, which have been the president and his advisors, didn't think it was necessary. So while strategic and operational are different, you have to have operational to support strategic. And so we can see that in some cases, and maybe in all cases, even though these are opposites, or we think of them as opposites, they're not mutually exclusive. These are the primary levels of change within the organization. And that's pretty simple to see, and I'm not going to go through this unless you can see this for yourself, and you can read it for yourself, and I think that's pretty understandable, so we don't have to spend a lot of time discussing each one of these. Now, I think this is pretty easy to understand here in this levels of change. Each level is going to be affected differently. And the process of change will itself differ based upon what level it's in. So if you would like to, as I see it, the individual level will influence the team or department level, whereas the team or department level will eventually influence the upper level. And of course, we can look at it the other way around from the top down, where the organization would first affect the team or department level, which would then in effect change the individual level. Now, notice what he says here. Do we think that the change at the individual level would include such things like recruitment and replacement, training and professional development, coaching, counseling? I'll pick another one in there that's not on the slide, mentoring. That's changed at the individual level. But I don't think that we would normally say, okay, change is on recruitment and replacement. And why don't we think that? Well, we probably don't think that because the recruitment is an ongoing thing, almost always ongoing, and so is replacement. I mean, people transfer, people get promoted, people retire. So we know there's a replacement, and we have to recruit people to do that. Burke, in a way here, is saying that this is a change philosophy, if you will, to bring in people who are more attuned to what we need to do as opposed to what we're doing. Now, we may look at this as wholesale change, which would be revolutionary. It may not be. It may be evolutionary. But we need to think about those things as being changed, and we don't always think of them as change. Think about somebody who came to your organization as a brand new hire into your specific department, and that person is going to come into you and bring different skills and education than you've been familiar with in the past, hopefully for the better. And that's a change. We don't think about it that way, but we have to understand that it is a change. Here he's talking about at the group level, team level, department level. Notice what he's saying here, that the focus has to be on team building and on self-directed work units. Now, as you know, or at least I think you know, or I hope you know, there is a bigger emphasis today in United States companies, the for-profit companies, talking about teams and teamwork and things of that nature than it has been in the past. That's because we're a very individualistic society, and we don't think of those things as much. It's my job, my responsibility. It's not that we don't share things, but we think of more of individual. That's our focus. That's our outlook. And this is a radical change as far as I'm concerned. Revolutionary change when we're changing the total system, because we're talking about focusing on mission and strategy, and last of all, but not least, culture, which is going to be very difficult for us to change. Difficult because we're into this scenario of we like where we are, we're comfortable in our clothes and in our shoes, and we want to continue doing things the way we've been doing them right along because it's easy for us. That doesn't mean to say the work's not difficult or the work's not challenging. It doesn't mean to say that at all. It just means to say that we're here, we know what we're doing, we're comfortable, we don't want to get out of this. We don't want to stay where we are. So, and if we just go back to thinking about at the individual level, recruitment and replacement, and that has to affect everything along the line. Now, it may not get so high as to affect the organization itself, although, of course, if you bring in enough new people with different skills and different mindsets, et cetera, and being more open to change, then the organization is going to change. But certainly, if you bring enough people in recruit enough people and replace enough people at the individual level, that's going to affect the group level, the team level, the department level. It has to. It can't do anything other than that. Now we're going to look at how organization change occurs. We're going to change culture. As this slide says, we have to change behaviors first. If we don't change behaviors, we can't change the underlying attitudes and values that will eventually change the culture. So if we think that we're going to change the culture overnight simply by turning on a light switch, we have to think differently about that. We have to change people incrementally, okay? Now, I know that may sound like heresy when we're talking about revolutionary change, et cetera, et cetera. I just don't think, this is me talking, not anybody else. I just don't think you can change people radically. I think people may be ready to accept radical change when they see it, but I don't think you as an individual can change people radically. You can put things in place to do that, but I think it will be incremental at first, and then once they can see the big picture, understand it, and see the benefits of it, you might find that radical change. But I don't think it's a process that is going to happen. And of course, it won't happen unless the new vision is articulated well. Now we're still continuing with organization change. And here we're talking about process. talking here about implementation, and not only implementation, but people adopting the change, not adapting the change, adopting the change. So here we're talking about, at least as far as I'm concerned, we're talking about adopting the change philosophy. And I think if you get people, this is me talking, if you get people to adopt that philosophy, if they buy into it, then adapting to the change is easy. Again, that's my thought. So here we come down here. Again, I'm going to use a term I've used before. A process has to do with how change is planned, launched, etc. This is a blueprint. It's a roadmap. Now, the only thing about a blueprint and a roadmap that's a little different, at least than a blueprint, well, at least in our thought process, and once into implementation, sustained. Well, I guess if we want to look at a roadmap, not so much a blueprint, but a roadmap, sustained would be reaching the end point on our route, and then staying there, although we don't always think about that. So if you want to think of, and by the way, when I say this, I've never served in combat, but I know some of the principles of it. That you want to take an objective, and you've taken the objective, and now that you're there, you want to be able to stay there. So you want to sustain you want to sustain the gain that you've achieved. So you do things that you have to do to make sure that you can sustain that. And that could be interacting with the local population. It could be doing a number of things to make sure that the objective that you wanted to get to, you're going to be able to maintain and retain. Burke here is talking about organizational models. And he says that they're useful because they provide a framework, roadmap, blueprint, and they help us understand what we're doing and how we're doing it, and why we want to do it. And again, he's just continuing with organizational models. Pardon me. Simplify the change. And make the change, boil it down to things that are manageable. And this gets back to the idea of quick wins, that you can actually point to something and say, we've done this and we've made this better, and you can see this and how it works. Now, Burke says, when you choose a model, you want to ask, and these questions are important, so we want to articulate them so everybody gets them. In what kind of theory is this grounded? In other words, where did this come from? Who has validated what we're trying to do as a good strategy? What references can we look at to make sure we're doing things the right way, and we want to avoid doing things the wrong way? Does it have the most relevant key factors? Finally, is the model descriptive or is it prescriptive? So does the model simply tell you what it is or where you want to be, or does it not only do that, but it tells you how to get there? This is what you have to do to get to where you want to do. I'm prescribing for you the steps you need to take to reach the end state that which you want to be. Now, these are additional organizational change fundamentals. Notice what he says, that the change should be data-based and it should be measurable. If you cannot measure what you've done, then you're not going to be able to do what you want to do. And then last, change should have support. Now, he says, he uses the word should have the support of the organization's top executives. I would like to change that should to must. And if he does not, if you do not have 100% support from the upper echelons of the organization, the change is dead on arrival. Nothing's going to happen because there's somebody in a corner office somewhere in the building that's going to torpedo it because he or she doesn't like it, or he or she wasn't consulted, or other things that just don't make any sense. So this is very important for you to understand about support. I'll give you an example. There was a woman, a television personality here in Cincinnati many years ago, who really was very powerful in the organization that she worked for. And the television operation decided to have a new communications center. And they built one across the street, and they called it ComEx. Didn't have to go far to find out that name. But as they were making a public relations thing with us and showing this on TV and trying to get people to understand what they were doing, one of the longtime newscasters for the organization said, there's one person here, and he named her, who could come in here and say, I don't like this thing, we ought to get rid of it. He said that would torpedo everything. Now, he wasn't saying that she would do that, but he was saying that she had the power to do that. And because she had the power, even though she wasn't the CEO of the organization, the CEO would listen to what she had to say. And so that's the point I'm trying to make. If you have somebody who is at that fulcrum of power, and if he or she is uninterested in the change, doesn't see the benefit in the change, and lets that out, and people know that, then the change is dead on arrival. Well, there's one thing that I want to do here, and that's to have the lecture discussion question. And the lecture discussion question for tonight is to review pages 6 and 7, and to look at the Burke short story on launching organization change. What are the 2 points that Burke made there, and why are those points important to organization change? So read pages 6 and 7. What 2 points did Burke make about the organization change that was being pitched by the vice president at Columbia University? And why are those 2 points important? Well, I thank you for your attention. We'll be back next week and spend hopefully about the same amount of time on Chapter 3. And Chapter 3 is a brief history of organization change. We'll talk about Fred Taylor's scientific management. We'll talk about the Hawthorne studies. We'll talk a little bit about Fred Hertzberg and his motivating factors and hygiene factors, and a few other individuals. So I thank you for your attention tonight. I will have this uploaded, I said tomorrow, but I'll try to upload this before I leave tonight. And so it will be available to you, and I'll send you an email to let you know where you can find it. Thank you and good night.